a fake charity worker convinced my elderly mother to donate her life savings, so I tracked down the scammer and had her arrested at her own fundraising gala. Some predators see elderly people as easy targets for their scams, but they underestimate the fury of protective children who won't let criminals steal from their parents. A fake charity worker named Sandra thought she could manipulate my 78-year-old mother into donating her entire life savings through emotional manipulation and fraudulent sob stories. What she didn't know was that I work in fraud investigation, and that one phone call from my devastated mother would trigger a months-long investigation that would destroy Sandra's entire operation at her own charity gala. I'm Michael Chen, 45, and my mother Eleanor has always been the most generous person I know. Even on her fixed retirement income, she regularly donates to legitimate charities and volunteers at our local food bank. Mom's kindness and trusting nature have always been her greatest strengths, but they also make her vulnerable to people who would exploit her compassion for personal gain. The nightmare began 3 months ago when Mom received a phone call from someone claiming to represent Children's Hope Foundation, a charity that supposedly helped sick children in developing countries get medical treatment they couldn't afford. The caller, who identified herself as Sandra Williams, had done her homework about my mother's background and interests. She knew that Mom had been a pediatric nurse for 40 years before retiring, that she'd lost a grandchild to leukemia, and that she regularly donated to children's charities. Mrs. Chen, I'm calling because your name came up as someone who truly cares about helping sick children, Sandra said during that first phone call. We have an urgent situation with a 7-year-old girl in Guatemala who needs heart surgery, and we're trying to raise the final $3,000 to save her life. Sandra's approach was sophisticated and emotionally manipulative. She sent Mom photos of supposedly sick children, detailed medical reports that looked official, and updates about urgent cases that needed immediate funding to prevent tragic outcomes. Mrs. Chen, little Maria only has 2 weeks to get this surgery or her condition will become inoperable, Sandra would say during her frequent calls. Your donation could literally be the difference between life and death for this precious child. Over the course of 6 weeks, Sandra convinced my mother to donate increasingly larger amounts of money for various emergency medical cases. What started with a $200 donation for heart surgery became $500 for cancer treatment, then $1,000 for emergency brain surgery, and eventually $5,000 for what Sandra claimed was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fund an entire medical mission. Each donation was accompanied by fabricated urgency, emotional manipulation, and fake documentation that made the requests seem legitimate and desperately important. Mrs. Chen, I know this is a lot of money, but you're literally saving lives, Sandra would say. These children have no one else to turn to, and your generosity is their only hope for survival. Mom was completely convinced that she was helping save children's lives with her donations. Sandra had created elaborate stories about specific children, sent regular updates about their progress, and even had other people pose as doctors and grateful parents during phone calls to add credibility to her scam. But Sandra's greed eventually led her to push too far and target my mother's entire life savings. During what would be their final phone call, Sandra told my mother about a catastrophic earthquake that had supposedly destroyed a children's hospital in Central America. She claimed that dozens of children were dying because the hospital couldn't afford to relocate them to facilities with proper medical equipment. Mrs. Chen, this is the worst disaster we've ever faced, Sandra said with practiced urgency. We need to raise $47,000 in the next 48 hours to evacuate these children to hospitals that can save their lives. I know it's an enormous amount, but you're the most generous donor we have, and we're hoping you might consider a major gift to help with this emergency. Sandra convinced my mother that children would die if she didn't empty her savings account to fund this emergency evacuation. Mom, who had saved $47,000 over decades of careful budgeting and frugal living, agreed to donate her entire life savings to save the children Sandra claimed were in mortal danger. Sandra, if children's lives are at stake, I can't hold back, Mom told her. I'll transfer the money tomorrow morning. That's when Sandra made her fatal mistake. In her eagerness to collect the money quickly, she instructed my mother to wire the funds to a personal bank account rather than an official charity account. Mrs. Chen, because this is such an urgent emergency, we need you to wire the money directly to our emergency relief account, Sandra explained. This will ensure the funds reach the children faster than going through our normal donation processing. The emergency relief account was actually Sandra's personal checking account, but my mother didn't realize this until after she'd transferred her entire life savings. Mom called me that evening, proud of her generosity, but also concerned about whether she'd done the right thing by donating such a large portion of her savings. Michael, I gave a lot of money to help some children in an emergency, she said hesitantly. Maybe more than I should have. The charity worker said it was urgent, but now I'm wondering if I was too impulsive. When Mom told me she'd donated $47,000 to someone she'd only spoken to on the phone, my fraud investigator instincts immediately kicked in. Everything about Sandra's operation sounded like a classic charity scam targeting elderly victims. Mom, this sounds like it might be a scam, I said gently. Legitimate charities don't usually ask for someone's entire life savings, and they don't request wire transfers to personal accounts. I spent that night researching Children's Hope Foundation and found that no such charity existed. The phone number Sandra had been calling from was registered to a prepaid cell phone, and the address she'd provided for the charity was actually a UPS store mailbox. Sandra had stolen my mother's life savings through a completely fabricated charity that existed only to defraud generous donors who wanted to help sick children. The next morning, I contacted my mother's bank to report the fraudulent wire transfer and try to recover the money. Unfortunately, Sandra had moved the funds immediately after receiving them, transferring the money through multiple accounts to make it difficult to trace. I also filed a police report, but the detective assigned to the case explained that charity fraud cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute because the criminals often operated across state lines and used sophisticated methods to hide their identities. Mr. Chen, we'll investigate this case, but I have to be honest that recovery of funds in these situations is rare, Detective Rodriguez told me. These scammers are usually part of larger operations that are designed to disappear quickly after collecting money. But Sandra had made a crucial mistake by targeting my mother. I didn't just work in fraud investigation, I specialized in tracking financial crimes and had access to resources that most victims don't have. And I began my own investigation into Sandra Williams and her fake charity operation. Starting with the phone number Sandra had used to contact my mother, I was able to trace it to a phone purchased at a store in Phoenix, Arizona. Security footage from the store showed a woman matching the voice description Sandra had given my mother. The wire transfer had been sent to a bank account registered under the name Sandra Williams with an address in Scottsdale. When I cross-referenced this information with public records, I found that Sandra Williams was not the woman's real name. Her actual name was Michelle Torres, and she had a criminal history of fraud and theft dating back 15 years. Michelle had been arrested multiple times for charity scams, elderly abuse, and identity theft, but had managed to avoid serious prison time by moving frequently and changing her identity. But Michelle had gotten comfortable in Arizona and had established a more permanent presence there, which made her easier to track. Through property records, vehicle registrations, and social media investigation, I discovered that Michelle was living in an expensive house in Scottsdale and driving a luxury car, all funded by money stolen from elderly victims like my mother. More importantly, I learned that Michelle was planning to expand her charity scam operation by organizing a large fundraising gala for her fake Children's Hope Foundation. She'd rented an upscale event venue and was selling tickets to wealthy donors who thought they were supporting a legitimate charity. Michelle was using my mother's stolen money to fund an elaborate charity event designed to scam even more victims and steal larger amounts of money from people who believed they were helping sick children. But Michelle's charity gala would also provide the perfect opportunity to expose her fraud and have her arrested in front of all the people she was trying to scam. I contacted Detective Rodriguez and provided him with all the evidence I'd gathered about Michelle's true identity, criminal history, and current location. I also shared information about the upcoming charity gala and suggested it would be an ideal time to arrest her. Mr. Chen, this is excellent investigative work, Detective Rodriguez said after reviewing my evidence. We have enough here to get warrants for her arrest and to coordinate with Arizona authorities. But I wanted to do more than just recover my mother's money and see Michelle arrested. I wanted to protect all the potential victims who might be scammed at her charity gala and expose her fraud to the charitable community. I contacted the venue where Michelle was planning to hold her gala and informed them that they were hosting an event for a fraudulent charity run by a convicted criminal. I provided documentation proving that Children's Hope Foundation was fake and that Michelle Torres was using stolen money to pay for the event. The venue management was horrified to learn they were facilitating charity fraud and immediately agreed to cooperate with law enforcement to ensure Michelle's arrest and to protect the people who'd purchased tickets to her fake fundraising event. I also contacted legitimate children's charities in the Phoenix area to warn them about Michelle's operation and to ask them to alert their donor networks about the fraudulent charity using similar names and causes. The charity gala was scheduled for a Saturday evening at an upscale hotel in Scottsdale. Michelle had sold over 200 tickets at $150 each, marketing the event as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to directly save children's lives through emergency medical funding. She'd created an elaborate presentation about the fake charity's work, complete with fabricated success stories, fraudulent financial reports, and staged photos of children she claimed to have helped with donor money. Michelle was planning to collect additional donations during the gala through a live auction of life-saving medical procedures, where wealthy donors could bid on funding specific surgeries for sick children who didn't actually exist. On the evening of the gala, I attended as an invited guest, having purchased a ticket under a false name to observe Michelle's operation and ensure that law enforcement was positioned to make the arrest at the optimal moment. Michelle arrived looking elegant and professional, playing the role of a dedicated charity executive who had devoted her life to helping sick children around the world. She mingled with donors, shared emotional stories about the children her organization had supposedly saved, and prepared to deliver a keynote presentation about expanding their life-saving work. The irony was overwhelming. Michelle was using my mother's stolen life savings to fund an elaborate event designed to steal money from other generous people who genuinely wanted to help children. During the cocktail hour, Michelle worked the room like a professional fundraiser, building relationships with potential major donors, and setting up the emotional manipulation that would lead to larger gifts during her presentation. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," she said to a group of wealthy donors. "Every dollar raised tonight will go directly to saving children's lives. We have urgent cases waiting for funding, and your generosity tonight could literally mean the difference between life and death for these precious children." It was the same script she'd used to manipulate my mother, refined and polished for an audience of wealthy donors who could afford much larger gifts than elderly people on fixed incomes. That's when Detective Rodriguez and his team moved in to make the arrest. "Michelle Torres, you're under arrest for charity fraud, theft, and elderly abuse," Detective Rodriguez announced as Michelle was beginning her keynote presentation. The ballroom full of donors watched in shock as Michelle was handcuffed on stage while trying to claim there had been some mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," Detective Rodriguez addressed the crowd, "this woman has been operating a fraudulent charity and has stolen thousands of dollars from elderly victims by claiming to help sick children who don't exist." He explained that Children's Hope Foundation was a completely fabricated organization, that Michelle had no connections to any children's medical programs, and that all the money donated to her fake charity had been used to fund her personal lifestyle. "The event you're attending tonight was paid for with money stolen from a 78-year-old retired nurse who thought she was saving children's lives by donating her entire life savings," Detective Rodriguez announced. The donors were horrified to learn they'd been targeted by a charity scam and that their generous intentions had been exploited by a career criminal who specialized in manipulating people's desire to help children. Michelle's arrest at her own charity gala became a major news story that exposed her years-long pattern of elder abuse and charity fraud. The media coverage led to dozens of other victims coming forward with stories of being scammed by Michelle, using various fake charity names and fabricated causes. The investigation revealed that Michelle had stolen over $300,000 from elderly victims across multiple states over the past 3 years, always targeting people who had histories of charitable giving and using emotional manipulation about sick children to extract large donations. Michelle was charged with multiple felonies including charity fraud, elder abuse, wire fraud, and money laundering. She was extradited to multiple states to face additional charges for scamming victims in other jurisdictions. The criminal case resulted in Michelle being sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and being ordered to pay full restitution to all her victims. Her house, car, and other assets were seized to compensate the people she'd defrauded. Most importantly, my mother recovered her entire life savings, plus interest and penalties that Michelle was required to pay for the emotional distress she'd caused. But the consequences for Michelle extended far beyond just criminal penalties. The media coverage of her arrest and conviction made her a poster child for charity fraud and elder abuse, with her photo and story being used in training materials for law enforcement and protective services organizations. Michelle's arrest also led to new legislation in Arizona, requiring stricter oversight of charitable organizations and better protections for elderly donors who might be targeted by scam artists. The venue that had hosted her fake charity gala implemented new policies requiring verification of charitable organizations before hosting fundraising events. Several legitimate children's charities benefited from the publicity around Michelle's case, as donors who'd been targeted by her scam redirected their generosity to verified organizations that actually help sick children. My mother recovered from the emotional trauma of being scammed and has become an advocate for elderly fraud prevention, sharing her story to help other seniors recognize and avoid charity scams. "Michael, I'm not embarrassed that I got fooled," Mom told me after Michelle's conviction. "I'm proud that my story helped catch a criminal and protect other people from being victimized the same way." Some people have suggested that I went too far in investigating Michelle's operation, instead of just reporting the fraud to police and letting them handle the case through normal channels. But Michelle was a career criminal who specialized in exploiting elderly people's generosity and trust. She'd been operating her scams for years and had successfully stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from vulnerable victims. The police investigation alone might not have been sufficient to gather all the evidence needed to convict Michelle and recover money for her victims. My background in fraud investigation allowed me to trace Michelle's operation more quickly and thoroughly than overworked detectives might have been able to do. By exposing Michelle's fraud at her own charity gala, I ensured that her crimes were revealed to the charitable community and that potential future victims were protected from her scams. Michelle learned that some people have family members who won't let criminals steal from elderly parents without facing serious consequences. She also learned that targeting someone's mother is a great way to trigger a comprehensive investigation that will expose every aspect of your criminal operation. The woman who thought she could steal my mother's life savings through fake charity manipulation ended up losing 8 years of her own life to federal prison. Meanwhile, my mother is thriving with her recovered savings and the knowledge that her experience helped protect other elderly people from similar scams. Michelle's charity scam lasted 3 years. Her prison sentence will last 8 years, and her criminal record will last forever. I think the victims got the better deal when Michelle was removed from society and can no longer prey on generous elderly people who want to help children. Sometimes the best way to protect your parents is to use every resource available to track down the criminals who target them and make sure those criminals face maximum consequences for their cruelty. Michelle got exactly what she deserved: prison time and permanent disgrace. And my mother got what she deserved: justice, recovered savings, and the satisfaction of knowing that her story helped put a dangerous predator behind bars. The scammer who tried to steal my mother's life savings ended up losing her own freedom instead. That's what I call perfect family protection.